In 1981, a federal judge in Chicago signed an order authorizing the FBI to place a listening device inside a sitting judge's chambers. It was the first time in American history that a judge's private office had been bugged by federal investigators. The judge whose chambers were wired was a man named Wayne Olson, a Cook County Circuit Court judge who presided over narcotics cases, a man who came to work every day in a robe and sat behind a bench and heard evidence and rendered verdicts, and was in the formal sense of the word, the law. What the FBI heard in the weeks after the device was installed was not the sound of a man wrestling with his conscience. It was not the sound of careful concealment or anxious calculation. It was the sound of an ordinary professional day phone calls and conversations and the routine traffic of a busy office, except that threaded through the ordinary was the discussion of money. How much? From whom? For what outcome? The negotiation of justice as though it were a commodity conducted in the same office and on the same phone and in the same matter-of-fact tone as everything else. Wayne Olson was not unusual. That is the thing the FBI tapes established over the course of 3 years of investigation more clearly than anything else. He was not an aberration in an otherwise honest system. He was a participant in a culture, a set of practices and expectations and informal arrangements that had been operating in the Cook County courts for at least a decade before anyone wired his chambers. He did what he did, the way he did it, because it was the way things were done. Because everyone around him knew it was the way things were done. Because the system had long since absorbed corruption into its ordinary functioning, and the corruption had stopped feeling like corruption and started feeling like the job. This is a story about what happens when a legal system stops being the thing it is supposed to be and becomes instead a marketplace. About who pays the price when justice is for sale. About a young prosecutor who saw it and decided not to look away and spent 3.5 years of his life doing the most difficult thing he would ever do, which was to keep showing up every day to a place he knew was rotten while secretly helping to take it apart. Cook County, Illinois contains the city of Chicago and its surrounding suburbs, and is by population one of the largest counties in the United States. Its court system in the 1970s processed approximately 2.8 million cases per year. Traffic violations, misdemeanors, felonies, everything from expired licenses to murder. It was a system under chronic pressure, too many cases, not enough judges, not enough time. The machinery of justice in Cook County in those years was a machine that was always running behind. Systems under pressure develop workarounds. In Cook County, the workaround that had developed over the preceding decades was money. Not the crude, obvious kind of bribery, not envelopes of cash changing hands in parking garages, though that happened too. Something more structural than that. Something that had been normalized over years until it was simply the way the system functioned, visible to everyone inside it, and accepted by most of them as the price of doing business. New lawyers coming into the Cook County criminal courts were in many cases taught the system the way they were taught everything else, by watching and being told. Here is the clerk you talk to. Here is how you indicate what you need. Here is the approximate cost of a traffic dismissal, a misdemeanor reduction, a felony acquittal. The prices varied by judge and by case, and by how much the client could pay, but the principle was consistent. Outcomes in Cook County courts were with sufficient resources and the right contacts negotiable. Not every lawyer participated. Not every judge was for sale. There were honest people working in those buildings every day who found the culture around them repugnant, and who kept their heads down and did their work and tried not to think too hard about what was happening in the courtroom down the hall. But there were enough corrupt actors at enough levels of the system that the corruption functioned as infrastructure, as a parallel system operating inside the official one, reliable enough to be planned around, consistent enough to generate a market with recognizable prices. The people who suffered for this were largely invisible to the people who ran it. The defendants who paid for acquittals they might have gotten anyway. The defendants without money who could not compete with the defendants who had it. The victims and their families who sat in courtrooms and watched verdicts, delivered and trusted those verdicts as expressions of justice with no way of knowing what had happened before the gavel came down. Terrence Hake was 27 years old when he started working as an assistant prosecutor in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in 1978. He had grown up in Chicago. He had gone to law school in Chicago. He knew the reputation of the Cook County courts in the way that everyone who paid any attention to Chicago legal culture knew it as a place where things worked differently than they were supposed to work, where the formal rules and the actual practice existed in different registers. He knew this, and he had decided to become a prosecutor anyway because he believed in the work and believed he could do it honestly. What he found in his first months in the state's attorney's office was worse than what he had expected. He saw prosecutors accepting money from defense attorneys to reduce charges. He saw courtroom clerks who functioned as brokers, moving money between lawyers and judges with the practiced efficiency of people who had been doing this for years. He saw judges receive cash and return verdicts that had been agreed upon in advance in courtrooms, where defendants sat not knowing that their fate had been decided before the hearing began, where families of victims waited for justice that was already spoken for. He went to the FBI. Think about what that decision required. He was 27 years old. He was new. He had no guarantee of what the investigation would produce or whether it would succeed. He had no guarantee of his own safety. These were not abstract bad actors. They were people he worked with every day, people with connections and resources and reasons to want him to stay quiet. He had a legal career that he was putting at risk by agreeing to spend the next several years pretending to be something he was not. He agreed anyway. In April 1980, the investigation that would come to be called Operation Greylord, named after the curly wigs worn by British judges, formally began. For 3.5 years, Terrence Hake went to work every day as a double man. He was a prosecutor. He was also a federal informant. He was building relationships with the attorneys and clerks and judges who ran the corrupt network, and he was simultaneously recording those relationships, documenting them, building the evidentiary record that would eventually bring the network down. He wore a wire to bars. He wore a wire to the racetrack. He wore a wire to lunch. He accepted bribes, real bribes from real defense attorneys in real cases because accepting them was the only way to stay inside the system long enough to document it. He had to make friends he knew he would betray. He had to sit across tables from people he liked in some cases and listen to them talk about their families and their practices and their plans, knowing that the recordings of those conversations would be played in federal courtrooms. He had to remember every day that the version of himself he was presenting to the world was not the version that was actually operating. After enough time, he said it became difficult to know where the performance ended and where he began. The FBI's approach to the operation was methodical and at several points genuinely unprecedented. They established a fake law office on LaSalle Street in the Loop, a fully functioning office with a receptionist and filing cabinets, and the appearance of a legitimate practice staffed by agents and informants who understood the terrain. FBI agents posed as criminal defendants, getting themselves arrested for minor offenses, and then hiring corrupt lawyers to fix their cases, following the money through the system and documenting who received it and what they provided in exchange. When the tapes accumulated enough probable cause, they moved to the next level. They petitioned a federal judge for permission to place a listening device inside a sitting judge's chambers. The request was extraordinary. It had never been done before. A federal judge reviewed the probable cause showing and authorized it. The device went into Wayne Olson's office. What they recorded was in its way more disturbing than simple corruption. They recorded competence. Wayne Olson was not a fumbling amateur. He was efficient and businesslike in his corrupt activities. He knew the prices. He knew the process. He knew who to talk to and how to talk to them in ways that kept everything deniable. He operated with the confidence of a man who had been doing this successfully for years in a system that had given him no reason to expect it would ever stop working. The tapes recorded him discussing specific cases, specific amounts, specific outcomes that had been agreed upon before the cases were heard. On one tape, after conducting a transaction that the FBI would later use as the centerpiece of his prosecution, he expressed concern about the backlog of cases in his courtroom. He was a man who took his work seriously. The work happened to involve selling verdicts, but the seriousness was genuine. That combination, the real professional identity and the real corruption coexisting without apparent friction, is the thing that the Gray Lord tapes documented that is hardest to fully absorb. These were not men who had abandoned all pretense of doing their jobs. They were men who were doing their jobs in the way their professional world had taught them the jobs were done. Among the cases that Operation Gray Lord eventually illuminated was one that had occurred before the investigation began, a case from 1977 that the investigation made newly legible. Harry Aleman was a contract killer for the Chicago outfit, the city's organized crime organization. In 1977, he was tried for the murder of a Teamster official named William Logan. Logan had been shot to death outside his home. There was eyewitness testimony. The case was, by most assessments, a strong one for the prosecution. The jury never got to decide it. Aleman's attorney had paid Judge Frank Wilson $10,000 to deliver a not guilty verdict. Wilson delivered it. Aleman walked out of the courthouse a free man. Logan's family walked out of the courthouse with the verdict, and with the knowledge that the system had looked at what happened to their family member and decided it was nothing. They did not know why. There was no way for them to know why. The verdict looked like justice, like a judge who had reviewed the evidence and found it insufficient, like the system working the way the system was supposed to work. It would be years before Operation Gray Lord established what had actually happened, and more years still before the unusual legal question was resolved of whether Aleman could be retried, since he had technically been acquitted. Illinois courts eventually held that an acquittal obtained through bribery was no acquittal at all, and Aleman was convicted and sentenced to 100 to 300 years. He died in prison in 2010. But William Logan was still dead. His family had still spent years living with a verdict they did not understand. Think about what that means to have someone you loved killed, to go through the trial, to watch a verdict come in, and to come away from that experience with the legal system's formal answer to what happened to your family member, and to have that answer be wrong. not mistaken, purchased, and to have no way to know that, no way to ask about it, no way to do anything other than carry the verdict home and try to live with it. That is the invisible cost of Operation Greylord. Not the judges who went to prison, not the lawyers who were disbarred, not the careers and reputations that the investigation destroyed. Those are the costs that are visible and documentable. The invisible cost is the accumulated weight of every verdict in those years that was not what it appeared to be every family that left a courtroom with an answer that had been decided before the hearing began. On August 15, 1983, the Chicago Tribune published a front-page story revealing the existence of Operation Greylord. The legal community's reaction was the particular kind of not quite surprise that attends the exposure of something that many people already knew in general terms. The corruption in Cook County courts was not a secret in the circles where people worked with those courts every day. It was known the way things are known in a professional culture, without being formally acknowledged, without being a matter of public record, without requiring anyone to make a decision about what to do about it. The Tribune story forced the decision. It moved the knowledge from the private register to the public one, and once it was public, it required a response. 3 people connected to the investigation took their own lives in the period surrounding the investigation, some before charges were filed, some after. 3 others died before they could be prosecuted. The rest either cooperated or went to trial. The last Greylord conviction came in 1994, 14 years after the investigation began. 92 people were indicted. 17 judges, 48 lawyers, 8 police officers, 10 deputy sheriffs, 8 court officials, 1 robber who had been in the wrong conversation at the wrong time. The sentences ranged from probation to 15 years in federal prison. Several of the convicted judges had served on the bench for decades. They had presided over thousands of cases. The outcomes of some of those cases could be identified as corrupt through the investigation's documentation. Most could not. The system had been running too long, the records were too incomplete, and the will to reopen cases from a decade earlier was too limited for any comprehensive review to take place. The cases stayed closed. The verdicts stood. The people living with those verdicts on both sides, the wrongly convicted and the victims who received the wrong outcome, had no way to know which category they fell into. What Operation Greylord revealed about Cook County was not at its core a story about individual corruption. Individual corruption, a judge here, a lawyer there, each making private decisions to enrich themselves at the expense of the system, is comprehensible and addressable. You find the individual, you remove the individual, the system continues. What Greylord revealed was something harder to address: a culture. A set of norms so thoroughly embedded in the daily practice of the courts that they had stopped feeling like norms and started feeling like facts. The corruption was not a violation of the system's culture. It was the system's culture. The honest actors who worked in those courts every day and kept their heads down and did their jobs correctly were operating inside a structure that their integrity could not change because the structure was not built on integrity. The numbers make this concrete. 92 indictments, 17 judges, not one rogue actor, 48 lawyers, 8 police officers, 10 deputy sheriffs, 8 court officials. Each of these people had colleagues who knew what they were doing. Each of them operated in courtrooms and hallways and bars and racetracks where their activities were visible to people who said nothing. The people who said nothing were not in most cases cowards or accomplices. They were people making the calculation that anyone makes when they see something wrong in an institution they depend on, about whether speaking will change anything, about whether the risk is worth the likely outcome, about whether the problem is their problem to solve or someone else's. Most people in most institutions make the calculation in the direction of silence. The institution continues, the silence continues, the person with the wire has not yet arrived. The question that asks itself when you sit with this long enough is not why Cook County courts became corrupt. Courts everywhere exist under pressures that create incentives for corruption, and the story of Cook County is the story of what happens when those incentives are given enough time and enough space to become normal. The question is why it took so long for someone to do what Terrence Hake did. Why, in a courthouse full of lawyers and judges and clerks and police officers, each of whom could see what was happening around them, it took until 1980 for one person to go to the FBI. Part of the answer is fear. The network was connected to organized crime in ways that made confronting it genuinely dangerous. Part of the answer is self-interest. The system worked well enough for enough of the participants that the incentive to change it was limited. Part of the answer is the particular psychology of institutional cultures in which the norms of a workplace become the norms of the people inside it in ways that are difficult to see from the inside. And part of the answer is something simpler and less comfortable than any of those things. Part of the answer is that most of the people in that courthouse on most days did not have to directly confront the cost of what was happening. They were insulated from the Logan families, from the defendants, whose outcomes were predetermined from the people whose relationship with justice was being decided in rooms they could not enter. The people who paid the price were not the people making the decisions. They never are. Terrence Hake testified at the trials of 23 defendants. He became an FBI agent in 1984 when the undercover phase of his work ended. He spent the rest of his career with the Bureau, retiring from the Department of Justice in 2008. He wrote a book about Greylord published decades later because he believed the story had not been told fully enough from the inside, that the public record captured the indictments and the convictions, but not the texture of what it felt like to be the person doing what he had done. The texture, as he described it, was not heroic. It was exhausting and ethically complicated and lonelier than he had expected. He lived with the cognitive dissonance of spending his days in a corrupt system while working to expose it, of being trusted by people he would eventually betray, of performing corruption so consistently that the performance sometimes felt less like a role and more like a self. There were moments, he wrote, when he was not sure which version of himself he was. He was 27 years old when he agreed to do it. He was 31 when the undercover phase ended and the prosecutions began. Those 4 years in the middle of his 20s doing the most difficult thing he would ever do shaped the rest of his career and his sense of what he was capable of in ways that he said he was still trying to fully understand decades later. He did it anyway. That is the part I keep returning to. Not the heroism, the ordinariness of the decision made by one young prosecutor in 1980 to not look away from something he had looked at and found he could not accept. Cook County courts cleaned up in the years after Greylord. The reforms were real and sustained new oversight mechanisms, changed procedures, a different culture emerging from the ruins of the old one. The listening device in Wayne Olson's chambers produced evidence that sent people to prison and changed the way an institution operated. None of that reached the people who had already been inside that institution when it was running the other way. The Logan family, the defendants who sat in courtrooms where their outcomes were predetermined, the people who trusted a verdict that had been sold to the other side. They carried what they carried. They still carry it. The courthouse on California Avenue is still there. The cases from the 1970s are still closed. The records are still incomplete. And somewhere in the distance between what those courts were supposed to be and what they actually were for, at least a decade, there are people who never got the answer. The system told them it had given them. That gap between the official record and the actual history is what Operation Greylord spent 14 years trying to close. It did not close it entirely. It never could. What it did was establish on the public record something that everyone inside the system had always known and most had chosen not to say. That knowledge, the knowing without saying, the seeing without acting, is the story inside the story of Greylord. And it is older than the FBI investigation. It is as old as the first time someone in a position of authority looked at a corrupt transaction and decided that looking away was the easier choice. Terrence Hake decided differently. It cost him 3.5 years of his life in the most uncomfortable way imaginable. He said it was worth it. The question Greylord leaves behind is not about him. It is about everyone else in that building who made the other choice every day for a decade, and about how long a system can absorb that choice before it stops being a choice and becomes the system itself.